I felt moving or switching from Photoshop to Sketch. It was definitely a breath of fresh air, and it also gave me a good insight into today's software. And today things are very different. We have a lot of design software available to us. We have Sketch, we have Adobe XD, Figma, InVision Studio, and a few others. And even today, of course, you can use Photoshop or Illustrator to design a website, but do you really want to? I promise you, you don't want to do that. Instead, take my advice and use one of the apps that I mentioned earlier. Photoshop and Illustrator have their uses. They're designed for something completely different, so let them be used on those things that are good at. But for UI, UX design, things like this, use one of the apps that I mentioned previously. You'll thank me later. Now, for this course, I'll be working in Figma. Nowadays, this is my go-to app for UI/UX design and for a lot of other things, and I've been using it for a few years now. I also made a dedicated course on the topic that digs a lot deeper, and you can find a link to that down below. Now, obviously, you're free to use any design software you want, but if you're still on the fence about this, I will highly recommend you take a look at Figma. It's very easy to use. It works in the browser. It's cross-platform. It has all the features you need for web design. Oh, and it's also free. So 5 great reasons for using Figma. Sketch is also a great option, but it's a paid app and only works on macOS. Adobe XD is also very popular and works on both macOS and Windows. It's free and it has some pretty unique features. But honestly, XD seems to have fallen behind its competitors in terms of features. It's still updated regularly, of course, but the features that are coming in seem a bit underwhelming compared to what Figma and Sketch are doing nowadays. Of course, I might be wrong about that. It's just my personal opinion, but still, my recommendation is Figma. Of course, you're free to use any design software you want. Everything that you'll be learning in this course can be successfully applied to other software other than Figma, of course. But if you're a beginner and you're looking to start working with something that just works great out of the box, then Figma. So then, my young Padawan, have we learned anything from this lesson? Well, for UI design, avoid Photoshop and Illustrator and focus on using a more appropriate app. Sketch, Adobe XD, and Figma are great options to consider, each having their own pros and cons. And my recommendation is Figma because it's free, cross-platform, and works in the browser. All right, so hopefully at this point, you've chosen your weapon, so to speak. So now it's time to go to battle. But before we go to battle, we actually need to learn a bit more theory. And the first theory that we'll start with is the color theory. That's coming up next. When it comes to color theory, there is a lot of information out there, and if you did any kind of design work before, then you're probably familiar with the basics of color theory. But if you're not, or maybe you just need a refresh, well, this lesson is all about that. And I'll try and give you all the critical, essential information about working with color in web design without making it overly complicated. So let's see how it goes. Let's start with the 3 main categories of color. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. They're called primary because you cannot mix any other colors to obtain them. They're the building blocks from which all other colors are created. Secondary colors are obtained by equally mixing primary colors. So, if we mix red and blue, we get purple. If we mix red and yellow, we get orange. And if we mix yellow and blue, we get green. Tertiary or intermediate colors are obtained by combining primary and secondary colors. These are blue-green, blue-violet, red-orange, red-violet, yellow-orange, and yellow-green. It's also important to know the color terminology. So let me show you a few key terms you need to understand. And I'll explain these concepts while working in Figma. So I opened up the color picker, and the first term I want you to get familiar with is hue. And hue represents the dominant color in a color family, right? For example, pure red, pure blue, pure green, just pure yellow, etc., etc. So the ones that you can see here in this section are the hues, and they represent like the purest colors in the family. And more than often, when we use the term color, we are referring to the hue. So then after hue, we have to talk about tints, shades, and tones. A tint is when you add white to a specific color. So for example, if I were to duplicate this color, and I'm going to create a white background over it and set its opacity to, let's say, 10%, or let's say 40%, so you can more clearly see. We just created a tint because we mixed white with the color that we had before, right? And of course, this works with any base color. If I change this to a blue, you'll see that I have the original hue right here. And then by adding white, I created a tint. That's all there is to it. Using a color picker, we can add a tint by moving the color cursor to the left. See where the white is right here? So we actually stay on top and we move to the left, and we're going to achieve exactly the same result. By doing this, we're basically mixing that pure color that we see here, right, in the top corner with white. So that's a tint. A shade is mixing that color with black. So if I change this to black instead, we'll get a darker version of that hue. And in the color picker, you can get that by moving the color cursor down towards black, right? Essentially mixing that color with black, just like this. So that's a shade. It's a darker version of the hue. Now, a tone is when you mix a pure color with a gray. So black and white. So I can basically take this and I can move my cursor something like this. So this is like an equal mix of white and black, essentially giving me a gray color, right? And in the color picker, because I'm mixing with both black and white to mix with gray, I can move this cursor like this, diagonally, or I can move it like this or like this. Depends on the kind of gray I'm looking for, right? So as you can see, as I'm moving it like to this side, we're kind of getting the same color as we did here. So that's a tone. It's the mix of a pure color with gray. Another term that you'll hear a lot when talking about color is saturation. And saturation basically refers to how rich or how dull a color is. So for example, if I set this color right here, it's the purest version, so it's saturation 100%. But if I start mixing in some gray, you'll see that that color becomes desaturated, right? It's muddier looking. It's not as sharp and as vibrant as the pure color. So that's saturation. Another term you'll hear is brightness, and that just basically tells you whether the color is closer to white on the scale or closer to black on the scale, right? So this is, in terms of brightness, this is less bright than, for example, this one, because this one is closer to white and this is closer to black. That's brightness. And finally, let's talk about color temperature. That basically tells us whether a color is warm or cold. And cold colors are considered these right here. So blue, green, purple, so around this area, and warm colors are considered these: yellow, orange, red. That's what color temperature refers to. When working with color, it's also important to understand the different color models that are applicable, like RGB, CMYK, HSB. And I'm sure you've heard about these terms before, especially RGB, but maybe you weren't curious what they mean, or maybe you read about them and it sounded too complicated, but it's not really. It's actually very simple. CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And to create colors, this model uses what's called subtractive mixing. I won't go into details because this model is used for printing, so it's not that important for this course. This next one is important, and it's called RGB. We all know the term, right? Well, RGB stands for red, green, and blue, and it uses additive mixing of light to create different colors. When overlapping red, green, and blue at full brightness, we get white, and this is how screens work. A very simple explanation would be this. Every pixel on our screen is made up of 3 dots that emit red, green, and blue light at various intensities. So the brighter those 3 dots are, the brighter the color is going to be. When all 3 dots emit red, green, and blue light at full intensity, the result is white light. When those 3 dots don't emit any color, so 0 brightness, the result is black because that pixel is not lit up. So in RGB, you basically mix red, green, and blue to get the color that you want. Let me show you a quick example. In Figma, I open the color picker, and I'm going to use the format switcher to go from hex to RGB. And you can see that this pure red has the code of 25500. The first value is for red, and as you can see, it's at max. And by the way, if you didn't know this, 255 is the maximum value in this format, 0 is the minimum. And then green is 0, blue is 0. To get pure blue, we can set the red to 0, green to 0, and blue to 255. And then we get pure blue. Same goes for green. If I make this 255 and the other 0, so 02550 is pure green. But then, to achieve a certain color, I can start mixing these values. I can say, let's go with 100 for red, 150 for green, and maybe 240 for blue. And we end up with this color. But usually, you don't really do that. With RGB, you just, use the color picker, you define your hue, and that's going to give you exactly the amount of red, green, and blue in that color. And as I was saying previously, if we set 000, that's black, because no red, green, or blue is used. And if we go max on all of them, we get pure white. So that's RGB. The third and final color model we'll talk about is called SHB. and it stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. This uses a mix of these three attributes to create different colors.